Okay, welcome to the Campbell Webinar Series. Today we're delighted to have Joe McKenzie and Miranda Cumpston talking about synthesis methods other than meta-analysis, what to plan, when to use, and what they answer. And these methods come up often in complex reviews of social systems. So they're highly relevant to Campbell. And we're just really happy to have you here, Joe and Miranda. And Sue Brennan as well is joining as a co-author of this work. I think we'll just give people a couple more minutes to join and just let you all know that we're recording this session and we'll make it available afterwards on our website.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to come and present today, and welcome to everybody who I know might be joining us from the very early hours to the very late hours of the day. So we're very pleased to be here. And today I'm co-presenting obviously with Miranda Cumpston, but there are lots of people's work, particularly Sue Brennan and Simon Turner from Monash University, whose work has really underpinned much of what we're presenting today. So I'll get started. So the outline for the session today is basically in two parts. I'm going to talk to the first part, and I'm going to cover these questions. What are the advantages of meta-analysis and its extensions, which may seem an odd place to start when we're talking about other synthesis methods, but the reason for that will become apparent as I talk through this. I'm going to talk about what the reasons are for not using meta-analysis, and what can happen when a synthesis is not undertaken, and what alternative synthesis and presentation methods might be used. And that's really going to encapsulate the when to use particular methods and what they answer. In part two, Miranda's going to talk about current practice from some work that she led during her PhD, looking at what review authors are actually doing in practice, and then talk about what to plan and sum up with some key points. Now, much of what we're talking about today really comes from the Cochrane Handbook, the Systematic Reviews of Interventions, and in particular from Chapter 12, which is about synthesizing and presenting findings using other methods. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a poll just to get you all thinking. And first of all, we have this set of studies, 5 studies here, which are presenting the effects of pedometers versus no or minimal interventions on BMI. And what we can see is we've got 5 effect estimates and confidence intervals associated with those effect estimates. And this is fictional data. And the question I have for you is, are pedometers effective for reducing BMI? And the response options that I'd like you to consider are yes, probably, no, or you don't know. So Vivian, if you're able to commence that poll.
I think so. Did that work?
Seems to.
Okay, good. Right, some people are answering. So we've got 4 responses, so folks could. I think I've got both of the poll questions up, I'm afraid. So also I have the question, how did you come to your conclusion? So people are answering both at the same time, I'm afraid. Right. Sorry about if you didn't want them both at the same time, but we've got about 10 responses now. It's about 20 people online, so keep them coming.
Right, so you've stolen my thunder with the second.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. But
this is efficiency, so it's very good.
Okay. I think,
all right,
can
so
I end the poll and show? I think it'll show the results.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay, and as I end the poll, people start to reply. So there we go. Share results. So can you see? Yeah,
I can see. I hope others can see. Anyway, for the first question, are pedometers effective for reducing BMI? We had 21% said yes, 43% said probably, 14% said no, and 21% said don't know. And then when we got to how did you come to your conclusion, then in terms of 14% said looked at the direction of the effect, 79% said looked at the direction of the effect in their confidence intervals. 7% said did something different. And so what I want you to take away from this poll is really what you can see is that even for a very simple data set where in fact we've just got a very simple outcome in terms of BMI that's consistent across the studies, we still have a huge variety of responses in terms of how people are interpreting these effects when we don't have meta-analysis. And so this really brings home the point that reporting of what you do is incredibly important. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to keep coming back to this framework or table here that really outlines the available methods for summary to synthesis. On the right-hand end here, we have the preferred statistical methods, and these are the methods that you're most likely to be familiar with. They're the meta-analysis methods, including pairwise, network, and subgroup, and I'm going to talk shortly about why these are the preferred methods. And then I'm going to move on to other methods that we might use in particular circumstances, which is really the kind of central focus of what we're talking about today, the acceptable statistical methods, but methods that really don't give you as much information as the preferred methods. So what are the advantages of meta-analysis and its extensions? Well, first of all, it allows us to estimate an average intervention effect. So it allows us to interpret basically a set of data that might otherwise be very difficult to interpret if we didn't have a method like this. It obviously provides increased precision for the estimated intervention effect, and it allows us to examine how consistently or the consistency of those effects across studies. And then we have extensions such as subgroup analysis and meta-regression, and this allows us to examine whether specified factors might modify the magnitude of intervention effects and explain statistical heterogeneity. And obviously this is really key because if the effect of our intervention tends to vary by particular factors, then we really want to know what those factors are because that's helpful for decision making. And then, of course, we've got the extension of network meta-analysis, which allows us to move beyond pairwise meta-analysis and to actually estimate the relative effects of many interventions for the same health condition. So the question might be then, well, why would we not ever use meta-analysis? And I'm sure you've all encountered situations where it's not possible to use meta-analysis, but I really want to kind of recap the ideas around why meta-analysis might not be possible given what its benefits actually are. Well, there are kind of legitimate reasons that we can consider. 4 of these are that there might be obviously limited evidence for a pre-specified comparison. So there might be 1 or no studies. It could be that there's incompletely reported outcome or effect estimate, or it could be that there are different effect measures that are used across studies. So some studies might use time to event data and calculate hazards ratios. In other studies, they might use risk ratios. And then, of course, there's bias in the evidence. So where we might have missing studies or missing outcomes or bias within those studies. And these are legitimate reasons for why we might not want to undertake a meta-analysis. Then there are another set of reasons that are commonly cited reasons, but where meta-analysis might still be considered. So for example, where there's a lot of clinical or methodological diversity, it could be the case that we might consider, and suppose this was unexpected, we might consider modifying our comparisons with a rationale. It could be that we observe a lot of statistical heterogeneity, and in that case, we might attempt to reduce or explain that or present prediction intervals to describe that variation in intervention effects. It's important to note that arguments against using meta-analysis because of too much diversity equally apply to the other synthesis methods that I'm going to talk about today. But what I'm really going to focus on here is legitimate reasons for not being able to undertake meta-analysis. And these are the 2 here where you might have incompletely reported outcome or the effect estimate, or there might be different effect measures across studies. So what do I really mean by that? Well, here's some scenarios that you might encounter as a review author. So if we consider a single study and an outcome, it could be the case that we have a study report where the estimate of intervention effect is reported. The variance of that estimate is also reported, So that might be through a confidence interval, or there might be statistics reported that we can calculate that information. And of course, if we've got the actual estimate of the intervention effect, then we know the direction of the intervention effect and the exact p-value. But the world's not very perfect when it comes to study reports, as we know, and it may be the case that when we pick up a study report, what's reported is the estimate of the intervention effect or the statistics to calculate that, but there's not information presented on the variance of that estimate. And it could be from that, obviously, we can calculate the direction of the effect. And then we get to studies where there's less reporting. So it might be that the study authors say the intervention was beneficial, or they say it was harmful, and they have a statement around statistical significance. And then at the kind of worst level, we have maybe the direction of effect only being reported. That's one study and a single outcome. But then across studies, you might encounter a mix of information above. And there are a range of effect measures reported for the same outcome or domain. And so this is what really makes things complicated to use meta-analysis of effect estimates. So what happens, though, when we don't undertake a synthesis? Well, here's just an example from a review, which is, I think, quite common in the literature, this type of approach, where you'll read, so in this particular review is looking at the effects of patient-held medical records for patients with chronic disease. And in their statistical synthesis section, they say a statistical meta-analysis was not appropriate, so we undertook a narrative synthesis. And that's the only information they provide. And then what they do is they basically structure the review by chronic condition, and then within condition, they reported the individual results for each outcome within each study. And the results were only completely reported when they were statistically significant. So here you can see the 3 studies, and within that there's a description of all outcomes that fall within the studies that are relevant for diabetes. But then what happens is they ultimately conclude in this review that there's no evidence of benefit of implementing patient-held medical records. And there's no transparency at all around how they get from this kind of study-by-study reporting to this overall conclusion. So reporting results study by study leaves readers to make sense of the results, and it's open to misinterpretation, and it risks highlighting some studies or findings without appropriate justification. And I think this is particularly true when it's done in text. There's often a lack of transparency in how conclusions are actually reached. So users of a review really need to know the path taken to get from the results to the conclusions. And this is irrespective of whether the method for doing so is valid or not. As a first step, we need complete reporting so we can understand what reviewers have actually done, and it allows a user to make an assessment as to whether they think that's a valid approach or not. So what alternative synthesis and presentation methods might be used? So now I'm going to really answer the question of when to use particular methods and what they might answer. And what I'd like to just highlight here is that Cochrane has funded a project to develop 2 worked examples to demonstrate the application and presentation of other statistical synthesis methods. This involved myself, Sue Brennan, Simon Turner, Miranda, and representatives from the Consumers and Communication Group and Cochrane Handbook, Rebecca Ryan and James Thomas. And so I'm just going to present part of one of the worked examples here today to provide some context for the application of methods. So this was from a review looking at interventions to reduce ambient particulate matter, air pollution, and their effect on health. And what they have here in this diagram is the logic model. And you can see here under the interventions, there are many interventions they're actually interested in. What I'm going to present today is really those around vehicular interventions. And there's quite a lot of complexity in these interventions. So they're looking at the effects of reducing ambient particulate matter for automobiles and other forms of transport, such as public transport, aeroplanes, and ships, as well as interventions to reduce traffic congestion. And then over here, they've got a set of outcomes, the ambient air quality outcomes. They've set out primary outcomes and secondary outcomes, and then they also have health outcomes, but I'm just going to focus on some of these ambient air quality outcomes. What makes this review, I guess, more complicated also is that they also include a wide range of study designs, ranging from randomized trials to controlled before after studies and interrupted time series, and different versions of those types of study designs. And often the statistics and the analysis methods tend to differ across those study designs. And so that adds a level of complexity when we come to try and do a meta-analysis. So I'm going to come back to our table here. And what I just want to show from this example is really basically one key method, I guess, if you like, is really the importance of tabulation or structured summary of evidence. And this is actually important for any review, irrespective of whether you do meta-analysis or use other synthesis methods. But I would argue it's more important when you have not used meta-analysis. So here is an example of what data could be presented. So obviously we've got the study name here. We have information on the design. We have a risk of bias assessment here. And we have the outcome, and we have statistics around the pre-intervention and post-intervention and the intervention and control groups. And then we've got this percentage change in the intervention group and in the control group. And what you'll see here is this last column here is really about the direction of the effect. So whether the intervention looks favourable to the control group or the intervention group. Now, this table has been ordered by comparison. You can't see the comparison because I'm only showing one comparison here, but it's also ordered by the risk of bias, by the outcome and risk of bias assessment. So if I look at this particulate matter 10, you can see that the studies that are a lower risk of bias, where the double pluses here, are given prominence because they sit higher in the study, in the list of studies. This column here that's showing us whether the intervention favours the control or whether the effect favours the control or the intervention is kind of our standardised effect. So this is equivalent in a meta-analysis to reporting the actual effect estimate. And I'm showing this because I'm shortly going to show you one of the methods that we can, alternative synthesis methods, called vote counting based on the direction of effect. Now, presenting the actual effect estimate, whatever that might be, is very important for aiding in transparency. So this is the set of methods that we've proposed could be used if meta-analysis cannot be used. And this includes vote counting based on the direction of effect, combining p-values, and the summary of effect estimates. And I'm just going to talk briefly about these in the next slide. So summarising effect estimates addresses the question of what's the range and distribution of the observed effects. And all we need to use this method is an estimate of the effect from each study. So unlike meta-analysis, where we need an estimate of the effect and its variance, we don't need that for this particular method here. So if we've got a set of studies and a lot of them are not reporting that information, or for some reason the variances would be incorrect, then this might be an approach that we would use. Then we have the combining of p-values, and this addresses the question of, is there evidence that there is an effect in at least one study? And essentially what happens here is that we basically meta-analyze the p-values that might be reported across the studies, and then we can do a hypothesis test on that meta-analysis of p-values to answer this particular question. Now, to use that method, what we need to know for each study is the direction of effects, whether it favours the intervention or the control, and what the precise or the exact p-value is. And so then the final method is vote counting based on the direction of effect. And this just answers a question of, is there any evidence of an effect? And the only information that we need to use this method is the direction of effect. So what you can see is, as the information becomes more limited in what's being reported within the studies, it kind of dictates to some extent the particular synthesis method that we might use here. And another point to note here is that actually it's only summarising the effect estimates that will give us some quantification of the size of the effect. These other two methods don't provide that information. So if we are using these other two methods, it's always important to report the effect estimates when they're actually available, in addition to the synthesis method. Okay, so I'm just going to focus a little bit more on this last one. I won't have time to go through the other two today. So coming back to our data here in the table, what I'm going to focus in on this particulate matter 10 here. And now all I've got is my standardized statistic over here being a 0 if it favors the control, and a 1 if the intervention effect favors the intervention group. And so all we do for each study is categorizing the direction of effect. And then we can count the number of effects showing benefit and the number showing harm. And we can accompany this account with a hypothesis test of whether the true proportion of effects favoring the intervention is equal to 0.5. Because if it was the case that the intervention was not having any effect, then we would just expect the effects to randomly vary around 0.5. And we can also calculate a confidence interval for that proportion. An important point to note here, something I talk a lot about in workshops that we give about this, is that in working out the direction of effect, we don't take statistical significance into account. And the reason for this is that underpowered studies that don't necessarily rule out clinically important effects are always going to be counted as not showing, or mostly counted as not showing benefit. And so that means in our vote count, we end up giving, they will always contribute basically inappropriately to the null hypothesis. And so that's the reason why we don't include statistical significance in the vote count. And so here I've just presented a table. There's all the outcomes here. I'm just again focusing on this particular matter 10. There were 11 studies, 6 favoured the intervention. So 50, that's a proportion of 0.55 or 55%. We can calculate a confidence interval for that and a p-value from the statistical hypothesis test. And we might conclude here something like there was no evidence that vehicular interventions reduced particulate matter 10, with 6 of 11 studies favouring the intervention, although there was large uncertainty in this estimate. And the available effect estimates are reported in the table. So you would always report the available effect estimates in addition to the synthesis method here. Now, what I've been focusing on really in this table is the synthesis methods, but also there are kind of accompanying plots that go with these synthesis methods. And these are examples along the bottom. And I'm just going to focus on the harvest plot, in fact, that accompanies vote counting. So this is what the traditional harvest plot looks like. What we have here is that basically each of these subplots is for each of the outcomes, and each bar represents a study. So bars on the left here are those where the effects favour the intervention, and bars on the right are those where the intervention favours the control. And you can do a whole lot of annotation of these bars. So the numbers in here indicate the studies. The height of these bars in this case represent the risk of bias. So we're giving more prominence to studies that have been assessed as having a low risk of bias. And then also in this case, the particular study design is denoted by the shading. Simon Turner has developed a slightly different version of the harvest plot, which I think is very good because it kind of reflects the vote count more obviously. And so taking that particulate matter plot that we just looked at on the previous slide, what we can do here is just basically stack the effects. And so we can immediately see what the vote count is. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 effect estimates favouring the intervention, 5 favouring the control. Again, we can kind of use different symbols and shading to depict different aspects. So in this case, we're depicting risk of bias by different symbols and colours, and the shading is depicting the different study designs. And what you can also do with this plot is that you can stack based on different criteria. So you could stack based on the risk of bias. So here you can immediately see that if you just were interested in looking at the studies that were low risk of bias, it becomes very evident what the vote count is when you do that. So I think this is a nice way to really present information where you've got a number of outcomes and you're trying to have a smaller figure to do so. And there are other sets of plots as well that are combined with these other synthesis methods. and these are shown in the Cochrane Handbook. So we've got, when we're presenting a summary of the effect estimates, we might use box and whisker plots or dot plots. When we combine p-values, we can use these albatross plots, which are very neat plots and allow us to kind of gauge what the size of the effect might be just from minimal information around p-values and sample sizes. And this is the traditional harvest plot here. So that is me done. So I can hand over to Miranda now. I'm not sure, I'm just a little bit over time. So maybe we want to hold questions to the end.
Happy either way.
Should we maybe take 1 or 2 questions and then jump in? I know I already got one comment saying they really enjoying this. So are there any burning questions of clarification? Folks online, you can type in the chat or you can unmute and ask your questions. There's no burning questions.
Silence.
I love the harvest plot. I have to say, I'm going to be reading about that. That's great. Okay, so maybe Miranda.
Hold on. I've stopped being able to hear you, Vivian. Hold on.
Because you muted me. That's okay.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. I was just trying to move the pictures out of the way of the slides. Can you see my slides now?
Yep. And I see one person has submitted a question, but maybe we can take those after. So go ahead, Miranda.
All right. So thank you very much, Jo, and it's great to be here. So I'm just going to carry on from what Jo was saying about what the different options are, and I'm going to have a look at what we found in practice people were doing, and then what we might draw from that in terms of ways we can improve our practice. And this is very much something that I've struggled with myself in my review. So yeah, very much appreciate this guidance myself. So let's just, yeah. So essentially what we're trying to do and what we know people are doing in reviews, what I've been doing in mine, so we've got this research question, we've gathered a whole lot of studies, but for some reason we have not been able to use meta-analysis, so we haven't been able to use it for all of our studies or all of our outcomes. But reviews are still reaching conclusions and you know, drawing conclusions from that available evidence to answer the research question. So we were really interested to know, you know, we know there's a few different things that people can do, but what are they actually doing in practice? And so I'm going to go through a couple of studies that we conducted to have a look at that, and then have a look at what the implications are, what messages we can take away. So the first study that we did is published in JCE, if anyone would like to read up on the details and have a look at the very long tables of data. But essentially what we did was a survey of published systematic reviews. So we had a look at 100 reviews that were published a couple of years ago now in 2018. And we had a look across all of the methods that they were using for synthesis. So across all 100 reviews. What we did was we found the reviews on average had about 15 included studies, but that varied. They were across we were looking specifically at reviews of public health and health services interventions, but in the end we found that that included a very wide range of reviews. So we had a whole lot around consumer communication and participation, a whole lot around prevention and treatment of conditions. It was quite a diversity of topics. Some included randomized trials only, quite a lot included observational studies as well, or there's a couple with only non-randomized studies. And they also varied a lot in terms of how you might assess their methodological quality. So some reviews that scored very highly using various metrics, some that we would find their methods a little bit less strong. So quite a range of different reviews we looked at. So cutting direct to the chase, we looked at, we tried to examine all of the describing they did of which methods they were going to use. So in the method section of the review, we weren't comparing to protocols. We weren't interested in whether it was pre-specified or not, just looking for that description in the methods or wherever they were describing what they did. of exactly what methods they were going to use. And then we also looked at which methods they actually used in practice. And that was based on looking at how they talked about the results, what they presented in terms of tables or figures, whether or not they described it in detail. We were really trying to look at the numbers and what they did. So of those 100 reviews we looked at, 78 of them said they were going to use meta-analysis, and only 5 said that they were going to use another statistical synthesis method. Of those that were going to use another synthesis method, 2 of them talked about vote counting of some kind, and 1 was talking about using a median and interquartile range. We had 17 reviews that said they were going to use narrative synthesis or a similar phrase such as that, but didn't tell us exactly what that meant in terms of dealing with the numbers. And 13 of them didn't tell us anything about how they were going to synthesize their results until we got to the results themselves. So what did we find in practice? Well, just click through that a little bit. So in practice, we found only 58 reviews used meta-analysis as planned. And obviously there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. And 60, so more than half of the reviews, used another synthesis method of some kind. So that's a lot more than specified that they would do that in the method section. Most of those were vote counting. So having a look at those reviews that did use another synthesis method, 54 of them were using vote counting, and the majority of those were using statistical significance to define the vote counting, or we couldn't work out what the basis was. And as Joe's described, we really want to avoid using statistical significance for vote counting. We had a few that used ranges, interquartile range and median, and so on. Interestingly, of those 17 reviews that said narrative synthesis in the methods, most of those turned out to be using vote counting of some kind, mostly based on statistical significance. So as Joe indicated in her examples, this was the kind of thing that we could draw out of the text of how people were talking about the results. So although people didn't describe it as vote counting, they were drawing conclusions based on saying, what did the majority of studies say? Or, you know, X out of the total number of studies said this, and therefore there is an indication of an effect. So people were using that vote counting to draw conclusions, even though they weren't really describing the method as such. And so, you know, it's tricky to know whether everyone was intentionally using that method or whether it was just coming out in their descriptions unintentionally. And interestingly, we also found, just referring back to something else that Joe said about reporting the results of the included studies individually, we also found a lot of inconsistency in that. So people would often report different statistics for different studies if they weren't using a nice tidy forest plot for a meta-analysis. So sometimes they give us more detail about statistically significant studies. Sometimes they give us effect estimates for some studies, or separate intervention and control group data for others, or p-values for others. So there was a bit of inconsistency there. And obviously some of that comes from the included studies themselves, and that we can't necessarily help if the complete data isn't available in the included studies. But that really tells us that there was a lot of these other methods, a lot of reviews found that they couldn't use meta-analysis for all of their studies. A lot of reviews do use these other statistically significant methods, but they're not necessarily very well described, and they're not always the ideal methods to be used. And one of the other things that we checked was whether they explained why they didn't use meta-analysis. And the most commonly cited reasons related to diversity. So in the population, the intervention, the outcome measurement was often a reason people stated why they didn't use meta-analysis. And as Joe indicated at the beginning, sometimes the solution to that isn't with changing synthesis methods, it's going back to rethink which studies you're comparing. So that was what we found when we looked at published systematic reviews. The second study that we did was a set of interviews. So we know that we knew that what we could see in the method sections of the reviews, but we still felt that there was a lot to understand about what people were doing, how they were making the decisions, what methods were there that they weren't visible in the printed reviews, given that the reporting seemed to be limited. And so we conducted some interviews with, in the end, 12 experienced systematic review authors and methodologists to try and find out how they would approach these kind of scenarios, what kind of thinking goes into making their selection of methods. And so what we did to these very generous people was we presented them with a scenario in which it was actually impossible to meta-analyze all the included studies. And we gave them a series of these scenarios, but this is just an example where we had an effect estimate and a measure of variance only for some of the studies. For the others, we had a range of different ways of reporting the results. So some individual group data, some p-values, some direction of effect without a measure of variance. So we had a diversity. And what we did was we asked people to think aloud about how they would go about interpreting these results, what synthesis methods they might or might not use, and then how they would draw conclusions. And we just asked them to talk through it with us. Now, one of the most reassuring findings for me was that everybody found this very challenging, and nobody was certain about exactly what the best method to use was. So it was a really interesting discussion about the different options available. We found quite a lot of different issues raised in those discussions, but just to summarize it briefly, some of the key things that we found that were really interesting. And the methods that they discussed fell into pretty familiar categories in terms of the planning for synthesis, selecting studies, which synthesis methods they would use. They talked a little bit about what you could pre-specify in terms of methods other than meta-analysis, but not very many of them did in fact pre-specify these kind of methods in their reviews. It was interesting to see how people went about selecting which studies to include in a synthesis. If none of the available options allowed them to include all the included studies, they had to think about which subsets of studies they could analyze. And so they might make different decisions about that, whether it was including as many as possible, including those that hadn't already been included in another method, including perhaps the most trustworthy studies, the low risk of bias ones, and so on. People took different approaches to interpreting individual study results. They looked at the direction of effect, the size of the effect, how big was the meaningful effect. Some of them did look at the statistical significance as well, especially where there was no other information. Different people would elect to use different synthesis methods. So all of those that Joe has mentioned came up to some extent. So meta-analysis, combining p-values, vote counting, using a range, etc. And different people would use different options in different cases. And people found it really a little bit challenging to think about how to interpret the results when you've used more than one method, and how people took different approaches to considering the consistency if they'd used more than one synthesis method for different results from that set. And we also gathered some really interesting information about the kinds of things that people would take into account to help them make that decision. So it was often about the objectives of the systematic review or the synthesis. Were they aiming to estimate a specific effect size, or were they aiming to explore heterogeneity? People trusted studies in different ways. So whether they trusted small or large studies, more high or low risk of bias studies, studies that had other unusual characteristics influenced their thinking about how to approach the synthesis. And then when selecting the synthesis method, they looked at which studies they could include, whether they were the ones that they considered the most trustworthy. They also considered how much information you could include. So could you include the majority of the studies or the majority of the participants, was something that people took into account. People had general beliefs or preferences about which synthesis methods they found most reliable. So some people found meta-analysis more reliable, would usually opt for it. Others found that it wasn't always useful, that it might oversimplify complex evidence or give more credibility to evidence they considered uncertain. People also really thought through what was going to happen in terms of the conclusions of the review. So would the using one method or another method change the conclusions? Would it make anything more certain if the overall evidence was uncertain? How would it inform the decision-making of the end users of the review in terms of perhaps a change in policy or practice? So we found quite a lot of useful information, really interesting information about how people go around making these decisions that often isn't accessible from the published reviews, and indicated that it really is quite a complex decision-making process with a lot of uncertainty around it, especially when we throw you in the deep end with a particularly nasty example. So our key findings of that were, when you can't meta-analyze all the available results, people were uncertain about how to do that, and that's okay. People differed in whether they would use one method or more than one method, and which studies they would include helped to inform that decision. Participants found it quite challenging to draw conclusions across more than one result, whether that was, say, a meta-analysis and a vote count, or whether they had, say, a vote count, but some extra studies you couldn't include in the vote count. They talked about a range of factors that influenced their selection, and some of them could articulate rules they used. So, for example, they wouldn't meta-analyze if they only had 2 studies, or they might give a hierarchy of methods they would use depending on the information they had. Thinking back to Joe's table about which methods work with different available methods. So just to sort of draw that home and think about what we might need to plan, what we might need to do differently to help us avoid that scenario where we haven't planned ahead for this very common situation of not being able to synthesize all the results, and then how we might make that clearer in terms of reporting. So in terms of what to plan, we would recommend considering at the protocol stage that it's possible that you will not be able to use meta-analysis. Some of you might well be doing this already, but then to think about what you might do instead. And that might include some more specific consideration of how you're going to handle those numerical results, so that you don't, in terms of describing individual study results, you don't inadvertently emphasize some over others. You don't emphasize the statistically significant ones over the others, and you don't inadvertently use methods like vote counting based on statistical significance. So to really give it some explicit thought and perhaps give a hierarchy of which methods you might use in different scenarios. And we would suggest that this should be considered separately from decisions about which study characteristics, which populations, interventions, and so on should be considered together. So that should be a separate discussion. And we'd strongly recommend that authors understand what the available methods for statistical significance, statistical synthesis, what those methods are, how to present them, in what situations you can use them and not use them, so that then you're ready and prepared when you encounter different scenarios in the data. In terms of reporting, we would recommend that that you explicitly report the methods used, whether they're pre-specified or post hoc. Really give a clear discussion of exactly what you did, including how you interpreted the results of the individual studies and how you synthesized the results to draw conclusions. And this is really important when you're vote counting, so that we know what the basis for the vote count was. We also recommend that you refer to the reporting guidelines. So there are 2 that are relevant. There's the SWIM, Synthesis Without Meta-Analysis Reporting Guideline, and PRISMA 2020 also addresses this to some extent. But both of these are really important. So the planning part is really important to give you a good scaffolding when you encounter these kind of scenarios, to make decisions that aren't done on the fly, that aren't overly influenced by the observed results in front of you, that don't emphasize some results over others, although we know that it can be impossible to plan for every scenario. Sometimes the data are just messy in ways you didn't anticipate. In terms of reporting, giving us this clear information allows readers to assess the decisions that you've made, the conclusions you've come to. We know that transparency can help people understand what you've done and trust what you've done. And it also provides help to other authors. So if we would love to see more examples of people describing this stuff in detail, so that then we all have a better sense of what options are available, how we might handle such situations as well. So just another quick thanks to the people who've all assisted with this, including the very generous interview participants. So that's a very quick rundown those findings. But yeah, very happy to take more questions for myself or for Joe.
Great. Thank you, Miranda. Thanks, Joe. There's been quite a few questions in the chat, and I can maybe just run through them if people haven't been able to follow them all. Joe has answered some questions about finding the handbook chapter and about code in R for the 2 worked examples. And whether I think these can all be applied in Stata, R, and Excel. Do you want to elaborate, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, vote counting is obviously very simple. So the actual method is, counting the ones and zeros, or so that can easily be done in Excel, and binomial test can be done in Excel. In Stata, you can easily calculate the binomial test and the count and the confidence intervals, and so that's the kind of vote counting aspect. Same in R. I'm sure the functions are easily there. The graphing is a little bit tricky. We decided to try and use R as the software package to implement the graph code because it's open source. So we didn't want to just have the code in Stata and limit the number of people who could access it. Having said that, I think the code is, at the moment, we've just, Simon's coded specific to the examples, and we'd like to kind of have more general functionality around that. But yeah, so I don't know if there's anything more to add to that. Just to say also that actually in the Cochrane handbook, the methods are all outlined there with some examples of the code to use in Excel. So we already have some of that in the public domain.
Great. Any other questions? Or maybe open up to questions for Miranda from everyone. People can unmute to ask a question if you like to, or raise a hand.
I mean, just to emphasize one of the questions that's in the chat that Joe answered as well was, would you use both? Would you use meta-analysis and another method as well? And a lot of the answers, it really depends on what you think will make sense for your analysis. So if you can meta-analyze most of the studies, you might just go ahead and use a meta-analysis and discuss the additional studies. It becomes much more of a tricky proposition if you can only meta-analyze half or less than half of the studies. But it really is something that requires a bit of thought and consideration and discussion with your co-authors about what's going to make the best use of your available data, what's going to give you, a helpful summary that will help your readers understand the evidence that's there without trying to describe each study one at a time.
Yeah, well, I guess that raises a question for me that when you do have, studies that can't be meta-analyzed, has there ever been an effort to compare what the results would be if you compare, the meta-analysis of the studies that do have sufficient data with, say, a method that uses vote counting, and see if you get the same result? Have you tried that?
We've been talking about trying to do such a study, but have not had time to do it. So, Joe, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so in fact, what we want to do is to take, basically, we can take the kind of, I guess, meta-analyses on the Cochrane Library, and we could randomly remove information and apply the different methods, and to see, even in fact, one of the studies we want to do is to just kind of apply the different methods and compare and see whether you would kind of come to the same conclusions. I mean, a lot of these other statistical methods, they lack power compared with a meta-analysis. And in fact, particularly when you get down to very few studies, so we probably would expect that we would end up with some difference if you were using these different methods. It's just, meta-analysis does kind of, you know, what I would say about these other methods, they become more and more reductionist in some ways. Like if you think about when we have an effect estimate and we've got a large number of participants and we've got observations and we're able to kind of reduce that down to a risk ratio or a mean difference or whatever it is. If we just kind of reduce that further and say, did the intervention effect favor the control or the intervention, the effect estimate favor the control or the intervention, we've kind of lost a lot of information as we kind of move down the methods. And in some ways, that's really why, when at all possible, we really want to use meta-analysis, because we don't kind of throw away so much information, which is very precious. So I would always say, you know, if you can have a statistician on your team who can help in some ways do some of the manipulation and imputation that you might need to be able to kind of bring together as many studies using meta-analysis of effect estimates, then that's really the place that we're best positioned in. But obviously there are situations where we have to move to these more reductionist approaches.
Yeah, that's great. I see that we have a methods editor from Campbell on in the participants. It's probably encounters the reporting of different strategies. Well, are there any other questions from the audience? I'm hearing none. So I'm thinking that we should give ourselves all a few minutes break between meetings, and also recognizing it's the end of your day in Australia, Miranda and Joe. So really appreciate this session, and quite a lot of chat in the discussion, and I'm sure that the recording will be well used as well. So thank you. And I think if people do have further questions, they could get in touch with you by email.
Sure.
Great. Have a great day, everyone, or a great evening, wherever you
too,
are.
Vivian. Bye,
All
everyone.
right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you later.